Hello and welcome back. Well, let's discuss the difference between centralized and distributed monitoring as code. During the implementation of the monitoring as code strategy, we can adopt one of two approaches to store the desired state of our monitoring resources: the centralized and the distributed approach. Each one has pros and cons, and we will go over some of them right now. Let's start by talking about the centralized approach. Well, the centralized approach, all resources are stored and managed in a single central repository, and this repository is the source of truth for the resource configurations and changes for the entire company. Well, we have some pros and cons on every approach for sure. So the pros are consistency and standardization. When you are using the centralized approach, we can ensure that resources configurations are consistent across the organization. The standard practices and compliance are easier to enforce because we have everything in the same repository. The second pro is the simplified management. With a single source of truth, it's easier to manage and audit changes, easier to implement security controls and access management, right? And the last is dependency management. Managing dependencies in a shared resources is simpler when everything is in one place. But we also have a few cons, which are scalability issues. As the organization grows, the central repository can become a bottleneck. High contention for resources might occur as multiple teams try to make changes simultaneously. The next one is the single point of failure, because if we have only one central repository, if something goes wrong with this repository, for example, if we got this deleted accidentally, we were gonna lose everything, and it can affect the entire monitoring deployment pipeline. Last but not least, we have a slower development cycle, and I think it's kind of related to the scalability issues. Because if we have a very big centralized repository with tons of monitoring resources, depending on the validations and the guidelines you want to enforce, you might take so long to validate everything that it needs. So it might slow down your development teams. So moving forward to the distributed one, this approach address some issues that we have on the centralized approach, which are like scalability issue. Like it's easier to scale as each team manages its own repositories, because on the distributed approach, we have the monitoring resources spread between two or many different repositories, and the organization of those repositories might be different depends on your company needs. It could be split by team, by project, or anyone. The next pro is the flexibility and autonomy. Teams can adapt their monitoring as code resources to fit their specific requirements and workflows. Faster iteration cycles, as changes can be made and deployed independently, so we don't need to wait in a longer process or a long validation step. The last one is resilience. Since we don't have a single point of failure, all the resources are spread across company and across different repositories. We can reduce this drastically. On the other side, we still have a few cons. We still have problems like consistent and challenges, because when you have the monitoring resources like alerting definitions or dashboards definitions spread across company, it's hard to validate all of them. So you probably need to build some CI pros that will be running on every repository to ensure that you have the same standards across your company. Complexity management, like it's harder to audit and manage changes across multiple repositories. If you have, for example, 300 microservices in every repository you have, for example, alerting definition, it's very difficult to provide a global view, at least for teams or groups and so on. And then we might also have some issues with coordination overhead, because one team can deploy a resource that will impact in another team. So we need to coordinate between teams to ensure that compatibility and avoid conflicts during deployment. Okay. Well, folks, both centralized and distributed monitoring as code approach have their strengths and weaknesses. Okay, this is completely fair. And the choice between them depends on the organization size, structure, and specific needs. The centralized monitoring as code, I think it's ideal for a smaller organization or for the organizations that requires a strict standardization. On the other hand, the distributed monitoring as code suits better for large, more dynamic environments that prioritize flexibility and also autonomy. Well, this is everything for the monitoring, distributed and centralized approach. Now let's move forward and see the importance of CI and CD process on the monitoring as code implementation. See you later.